13th September 1942, Central Stalingrad. Captain Klaus Bergmann of the 94th Infantry Division pressed his back against what remained of a brick wall, his hands trembling as he gripped his Mauser K98K rifle. Somewhere in the darkness above him, perhaps the third floor, perhaps the attic, a Soviet marksman waited patiently. Bergmann had witnessed 3 of his comrades die in the last hour, each shot through the skull the moment they revealed themselves. The structure they were attempting to capture was supposed to have been secured yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. It was merely one building, 4 stories of demolished concrete and twisted metal on a street whose name he couldn't pronounce. Yet his company had been battling for this single structure for 9 days, 9 whole days. In France, they had conquered entire metropolitan areas in less time. One sergeant, a veteran of the French campaign, had whispered before a sniper's bullet silenced him forever. In Paris, we advanced kilometers per day. Here, we measure our progress in meters, sometimes in the bodies of our fallen brothers. The building still hadn't fallen. Bergmann would meet his death in 3 days, his body joining hundreds of others in what the soldiers were now calling the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. His final thoughts would be of his family in Munich, wondering if they would ever know how he died in this hellish urban maze. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from the Second World War and help us reach more history enthusiasts. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done facing an enemy who transformed every room into a tomb and every corridor into a killing zone? This is the story of Stalingrad, not simply as a battle, but as the place where Nazi Germany's seemingly unstoppable war machine collided with a new and terrifying form of warfare that would ultimately break it. Here, in the ruins of a Soviet industrial metropolis along the Volga River, the Wehrmacht discovered that all their tactical brilliance, all their combined arms doctrine, all their blitzkrieg experience meant absolutely nothing when the battlefield was reduced to rubble and every staircase became a death trap. The Germans labeled it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. The Soviets called it hugging the enemy or close combat doctrine. History would remember it as urban warfare in its most brutal, intimate, and psychologically devastating form. This is the story of how a city became a nightmare that consumed an entire German army and changed the course of World War II forever. The path to catastrophe began with overwhelming confidence. By August 1942, Nazi Germany's war machine appeared unstoppable and invincible. Operation Blau, Case Blue, had smashed through Soviet defenses in southern Russia with devastating efficiency and brutal effectiveness. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group South had driven hundreds of kilometers across the steppes, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing vast territories with apparent ease. Panzer divisions raced forward under the merciless summer sun, their tracks churning through golden wheat fields that stretched endlessly to the horizon. The objective was crystal clear: seize the Caucasus oil fields that fueled the Red Army's war machine. If Germany controlled Baku's petroleum reserves, the Red Army's tanks would stop rolling, their aircraft would be grounded permanently, and Stalin's regime would inevitably collapse. But Hitler, never satisfied with purely military objectives, allowed symbolism to override sound strategy. Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city of 600,000 people stretching 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River, bore Stalin's name. The Führer became utterly obsessed. Taking Stalingrad would humiliate the Soviet dictator, provide a propaganda victory that would echo across the entire world, and secure the northern flank for the drive into the Caucasus. On 23 July 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 45, splitting his forces and making Stalingrad a primary objective of utmost importance. General Friedrich von Mannstein, commander of the 6th Army, received the order, "Take Stalingrad at all costs." Mannstein was 52 years old, a tall, aristocratic staff officer known for his methodical precision and unwavering loyalty to orders from high command.
He had never commanded an army in actual combat before this campaign, but he now led one of the Wehrmacht's most powerful formations, over 270,000 men, supported by the 4th Panzer Army, hundreds of tanks, and massive Luftwaffe support from the air. His soldiers were battle-hardened veterans who had conquered Poland, France, and vast stretches of the Soviet Union. They confidently expected Stalingrad to fall within weeks, perhaps even days. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the war's most devastating and catastrophic aerial bombardments. Wave after wave of Heinkel H-111 and Junkers Ju-88 bombers turned the afternoon sky black with aircraft, dropping thousands of tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs on Stalingrad. Entire neighborhoods vanished in massive fireballs. The oil storage tanks along the Volga River erupted in towering columns of flame visible for 80 kilometers in every direction. Wooden houses exploded into kindling within seconds. Apartment blocks collapsed completely, burying entire families in cellars. Over 40,000 civilians died in a single afternoon, more than would die in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 3 years later. The Volga burned with intense heat. The sky glowed orange even at midnight. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their city transformed into a landscape from hell itself. But the bombing, intended to break Soviet morale and facilitate a rapid advance, had an unintended and ironic consequence. It transformed Stalingrad into the perfect defensive position imaginable. Buildings became rubble, and rubble became fortresses. Streets disappeared under tons of brick and concrete, creating obstacles that channeled German advances into carefully prepared killing zones. The city's factories, the Badakati gun factory, Red October steel plant, and Desertsky tractor works were reduced to skeletal frameworks, but their concrete walls and industrial machinery provided cover that no army could destroy with conventional weapons. The Luftwaffe's bombs had inadvertently created the ideal terrain for urban defense. What von Mannstein and his staff officers didn't realize as they planned their assault was that they were about to encounter an enemy unlike any they had faced before, and a form of warfare for which their training, doctrine, and experience had left them catastrophically unprepared. General Vasily Ivanovich Petrov was not a man who inspired confidence at first glance. Short, stocky, with several teeth missing from a grenade blast years earlier, and possessing a vocabulary that could make veteran sergeants wince in discomfort, the 52-year-old peasant's son looked more like a street brawler than a brilliant tactician. But Petrov possessed something increasingly rare in the Red Army of 1942: extensive combat experience, tactical flexibility, and the moral courage to ignore orders he knew were suicidal. On 12 September, with German forces already fighting in Stalingrad's suburbs and the city on the verge of complete collapse, Petrov was summoned to the Stalingrad front headquarters on the Volga's eastern bank. There, in a dugout bunker, he met Nikita Khrushchev and General Andrei Yeremenko. The situation was absolutely desperate. Soviet defenders were being pushed back street by street, building by building. Morale was cracking badly. Units were breaking under pressure. Some officers were requesting permission to abandon the city and retreat across the Volga to safety. Yeremenko's question was blunt and direct. "Comrade Petrov, can you hold Stalingrad?" Petrov's answer was immediate and firm. "We will hold the city or die in it. There is no third option." He was given command of the 62nd Army, approximately 54,000 exhausted men facing a German force 5 times their size, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft dominating the skies. That night, under heavy German artillery fire, Petrov crossed the Volga in a small boat, shells exploding in the water around him, spray soaking his uniform completely. He established his headquarters in a series of bunkers carved into the cliffs on the western bank, close enough to the fighting that he could hear individual rifle shots and smell the acrid smoke of battle. From his position overlooking the burning city, Petrov made several critical observations that would revolutionize urban warfare forever. First, in Stalingrad's ruins, German advantages evaporated completely. The Wehrmacht's strength lay in combined arms operations, coordinated attacks by tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft across open terrain. But in a city reduced to rubble, where visibility was measured in meters, where every room was a separate battlefield, these tactics failed miserably. Tanks were vulnerable to close-range attack, unable to elevate their guns to engage defenders on upper floors. Artillery couldn't be used without hitting friendly forces in close proximity. Luftwaffe bombers were useless when Soviet and German soldiers were separated by a wall rather than a no-man's land. Petrov's doctrine was revolutionary in its simplicity. Hug the enemy. Soviet soldiers would stay as close to German lines as physically possible, within 50 meters, within grenade-throwing distance, sometimes occupying different floors of the same building. This proximity made German artillery and air support unusable and dangerous. The Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without killing German soldiers in the process. The battle would be fought at intimate range, room by room, with grenades, submachine guns, knives, and entrenching tools. Second, defense in urban terrain required aggression, not passivity or static defense. Petrov ordered his units to practice active defense, constant counterattacks, raids, and probing actions that kept the Germans perpetually off balance. If the enemy took a building in the morning, retake it at night without fail. Never let them consolidate their gains. Never let them rest or reorganize. Turn Stalingrad into a meat grinder that consumed German strength faster than replacements could arrive from the rear. Third, exploit the vertical dimension of urban combat. Buildings weren't just obstacles, they were three-dimensional fortresses. Defenders on upper floors held enormous advantages over attackers advancing from below. Staircases became death traps, easily defended by a handful of men with grenades and automatic weapons. Rooftops provided observation posts and sniper positions with commanding views. Basements offered shelter from artillery and concealed movement routes between positions. Finally, survive by making the cost of every German advance unbearable and unsustainable. The 62nd Army couldn't win through firepower or numbers alone. They would win by making every meter, every building, every room cost more than the Germans could afford to pay. Make them pay dearly in time. Make them pay in blood. Make them pay until their will broke completely. These principles would transform Stalingrad into Nazi Germany's worst nightmare. When German forces pushed into central Stalingrad in early September, they entered a landscape unlike anything in their extensive experience. The city was no longer a city in any recognizable sense. Aerial bombardment and artillery had reduced it to an apocalyptic wasteland of shattered buildings, cratered streets, and mountains of rubble. Water mains were destroyed, leaving stagnant pools breeding disease and pestilence. Fires burned continuously, their glow turning night into orange twilight. The German advance, which should have been a matter of days according to all tactical calculations, immediately stalled. Panzer units found the rubble-choked streets impassable for their vehicles. When they tried to maneuver around obstacles, Soviet soldiers emerged from basements and cellars to attack them with Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. A burning Panzer IV or Panzer III became a roadblock that delayed the advance for hours, while Engineers cleared it, always under sniper fire, always taking casualties from hidden positions. Infantry advances were nightmarish experiences. Buildings that appeared empty from the outside housed Soviet defenders in cellars and upper floors. Machine gun nests covered every approach from concealed positions. Snipers made movement in the open suicidal during daylight hours. German soldiers quickly learned that the standard infantry tactics that worked across Europe were utterly useless here. Advancing in formation got you killed instantly. Following the same route twice got you killed. Silhouetting yourself against the sky got you killed. Even taking cover in shell craters was dangerous. Soviet troops had pre-registered artillery on obvious positions.
The psychological impact was devastating and cumulative. In France and Poland, German soldiers had seen the front lines, enemy positions visible across open ground. In Stalingrad, the front line was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously.
The enemy could be above you, below you, behind you, on the other side of a wall. A building cleared in the morning was reoccupied by the evening through underground tunnels. Soldiers slept, when they could sleep, with weapons in their hands, starting awake at every sound, never knowing if Soviet troops were infiltrating through the sewers beneath them or through holes in the walls. One German officer, Lieutenant Hans Müller of the 24th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "We are fighting for every house, every cellar, every pile of rubble with fanatical intensity. The Russians are not human beings in any normal sense. We clear a building, leave guards, move forward. At night, the Russians emerge from sewers, from tunnels we didn't know existed, and retake it silently. We've taken the same apartment building 4 times in 8 days. Each time, they're waiting for us like ghosts. It's like fighting phantoms who know the terrain better than we ever could." Soviet defensive tactics evolved rapidly through trial and error. Small groups, usually 8 to 12 men, would fortify buildings, turning them into independent strongpoints capable of withstanding sustained assault. They punched holes through interior walls to create firing positions and escape routes, allowing defenders to move between rooms without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Windows were barricaded with furniture and rubble, leaving only narrow firing slits. Doorways were mined or booby-trapped with ingenious devices. Staircases were blocked at key points, forcing attackers into fatal funnels where grenades could be rolled down from above with deadly effect. The most feared Soviet weapons weren't tanks or artillery, but far simpler tools of destruction. PPSH-41 submachine guns with their 71-round drum magazines provided devastating firepower in close-quarters combat. RGD-33 hand grenades could be rolled through doorways or dropped from upper floors onto unsuspecting enemies below. Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline, kerosene, and sulfuric acid, turned men into human torches and could brew up a tank if thrown accurately at vulnerable points. And then there were the snipers who terrorized the German forces. Soviet marksmen made daylight movement a death sentence in many areas. Armed with scoped Mosin Nagant rifles, they positioned themselves in ruins with clear fields of fire, concealed among the rubble, capable of waiting motionless for hours for a single perfect shot. A German soldier who exposed himself for 3 seconds was dead before he realized his mistake. Officers, identifiable by their uniforms and behavior, were priority targets for elimination. Radio operators carrying distinctive equipment were killed first, cutting off communications between units. Medics wearing Red Cross armbands were not spared. The Soviets reasoned that killing medics increased the psychological burden on survivors, forced to watch their comrades die untreated in agony. The most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Andreev, became a legend during the September fighting. A shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had learned to shoot hunting deer in his youth, Andreev was credited with killing 225 German soldiers during the battle, though the actual number was likely much higher. His method was patient and methodical. Identify high traffic areas, find concealed positions with good sightlines, wait for targets to present themselves, take one shot, and immediately relocate to avoid counter-sniper fire. German command became so frustrated with his effectiveness that they allegedly sent their own master sniper, SS Standartenführer Heinrich Vogel, to hunt him, a duel that may or may not have occurred, but which became the subject of propaganda on both sides, and decades later, films and books. But individual heroics, while morale-boosting for propaganda purposes, were less important than the systemic transformation of urban combat. By late September, Stalingrad had become a tactical environment that negated every German advantage systematically. Their superior radios were less effective when units were dispersed across hundreds of individual strongpoints. Their tactical air support couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and rubble below. Their armor was reduced to supporting infantry in point-blank firefights where a single Soviet soldier with a magnetic mine could destroy a tank worth more than 100 soldiers. The Wehrmacht was being dragged into a form of warfare for which it was utterly unprepared, and which was consuming it steadily. Amid the chaos, certain locations became legendary symbols of Soviet resistance and German frustration. None was more famous than Sergeyev's house, a 4-story apartment building on Seleshnya Street near the center of Stalingrad, overlooking the 9th January Square. It would become the embodiment of everything that made Stalingrad a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. On September 27, 1942, Sergeant Sergei Dmitry Sergeyev led a 4-man recon patrol to investigate a building near the square. The building was occupied by German forces at the time. In a swift nighttime assault executed with precision, Sergeyev's group killed the Germans and secured the structure. Realizing its tactical value, the building dominated the square and provided clear fields of fire in 3 directions. Sergeyev radioed his company commander, "We're holding this position. Send reinforcements immediately." Over the next 48 hours, reinforcements arrived under cover of darkness: a machine gun squad, riflemen, an anti-tank rifle team, a mortar crew, eventually bringing the garrison to about 30 men. They were a microcosm of the Soviet Union. Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Jews, Tatars, unified by the knowledge that they were probably going to die, but determined to make the Germans pay the ultimate price.
Under Sergeyev's direction, the building was transformed into a fortress over several nights of intense labor. Windows facing German positions were bricked up entirely, except for narrow firing slits that gave defenders cover while allowing them to shoot out effectively. Interior walls were punched through systematically, creating concealed movement routes so defenders could shift positions without exposing themselves to enemy observation. Furniture, rubble, and anything available was used to create internal barricades and obstacles. The basement became the command post, protected by several feet of concrete from artillery bombardment. A communications trench was dug, mostly at night, under fire, connecting Sergeyev's house to Soviet lines along the Volga, allowing resupply and reinforcement under cover. The roof became a sniper's nest and forward observation post with commanding views. Soviet artillery officers, watching from Sergeyev's roof through binoculars, could direct fire from batteries on the Volga's eastern bank with devastating accuracy against German formations. German formations assembling for attacks on Sergeyev's house or nearby positions would suddenly find themselves under artillery barrage before they even began their assault, causing chaos and casualties. The Germans attacked Sergeyev's house repeatedly over the next 58 days, sometimes twice daily with full company strength, sometimes with tanks providing direct fire support, always with heavy casualties that mounted with each failed assault. German combat engineers tried flamethrowers, spraying liquid fire through windows and doors, but the building's layout prevented flames from spreading effectively through the fortified interior. Stukas dive-bombed it with precision, collapsing one corner of the structure, but the defenders simply abandoned that section and continued fighting from the rest. Panzer IVs and assault guns fired point-blank into the walls at ranges of 50 meters, punching holes through brick, but the internal fortifications protected the defenders from fragmentation. One Private Nikolai Sokolov later recalled, "We called our basement the fortress within the fortress. German shells would hit the upper floors and dust would pour down on us like snow, but the ceiling held firm. We had one rule: never show yourself in the same position twice. Fire 3 shots, move to another room. Throw a grenade, change floors immediately. The fascists couldn't predict where we'd be next." The defenders developed sophisticated tactics through experience. Anti-tank rifle teams armed with PTRD-41 rifles firing 14.5mm armor-piercing rounds positioned themselves to hit German tanks in their vulnerable side and rear armor when they maneuvered. Machine gunners created interlocking fields of fire that turned the square into a killing zone no infantry could cross. Snipers on the roof picked off German officers and NCOs with methodical precision, decapitating enemy leadership repeatedly. And when the Germans finally breached the building, which happened several times during the siege, Soviet counterattacks, launched from the basement through interior passages, would clear them out in savage close-quarters fighting with grenades and bayonets. The psychological impact on German forces was immense and demoralizing. Sergeyev's house became a symbol of the impossible, a single building that defied an entire army for 2 months. German soldiers began to view it with a mixture of frustration and superstitious dread. Officers who ordered attacks on the position knew they were sentencing men to death for questionable tactical gain. One German lieutenant wrote home, "That damned house has swallowed a company whole. Every attack is the same nightmare. We advance across the square, machine guns and rifles from every window. Our tanks shoot walls to rubble. We get inside, then grenades from every direction, Russians appearing from nowhere like demons. We retreat, count our dead, and headquarters orders another attack tomorrow. I don't know who's crazier, the Russians for holding it or us for attacking it repeatedly." When the battle finally ended in February 1943, Sergeyev's house still stood, a shattered skeleton, barely recognizable as a building, but unconquered to the very end. Vasily Petrov would later remark, with some propagandistic exaggeration but essential truth, that the Germans lost more men trying to take Sergeyev's house than they lost taking Paris. The building became a symbol that appeared in Soviet propaganda, was mentioned in orders of the day, and inspired defenders across the city. If 30 men in one building could hold for 2 months, what couldn't the Red Army accomplish? Today, the building still stands in Volgograd, as Stalingrad was later renamed, fully restored with a memorial wall listing the names of its defenders. It remains a monument to what urban defense could achieve and a reminder of the nightmare that became Stalingrad for the Wehrmacht. As autumn brought freezing rains that turned rubble into mud, the battle shifted north to Stalingrad's industrial district, 3 massive factory complexes that would become the scene of some of the most brutal fighting in military history. The Barricadi gun factory, Red October steel plant, and Desertsky tractor works. These were not merely buildings, but sprawling industrial labyrinths, covering square kilometers of territory. Before the war, they had employed tens of thousands of workers, producing T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, and steel for the war effort. Now, they produced only death on an industrial scale. The factory's massive construction, concrete walls several feet thick, steel beams, and machinery that couldn't be destroyed even by artillery, made them almost impregnable fortresses. But their size and complexity also made them nightmarishly difficult to defend effectively. A single factory might have dozens of workshops, hundreds of rooms, kilometers of corridors, multiple levels above and below ground, networks of utility tunnels, railway sidings, and crane systems overhead, creating vertical complexity. In late September, von Mannstein committed his reserves to taking the factory district, convinced that one final push would break Soviet resistance permanently. The 389th Infantry Division, 24th Panzer Division, 100th Jaeger Division, and elements of several other formations were thrown into the assault with orders to succeed at any cost. What followed was fighting of unparalleled intensity and horror. Soviet defenders, factory workers fighting alongside soldiers, had transformed each complex into a fortress over weeks of preparation. Workshops became bunkers with reinforced walls. Assembly mines became trenches with firing positions. Blast furnaces, some still radiating residual heat from their last loads, provided warmth in the freezing nights. Overhead cranes became firing positions for snipers and machine gunners who could shoot down at attackers from above with impunity. Underground tunnels allowed concealed movement between buildings without exposure to enemy fire. The Germans attacked with flamethrowers, engineers, tanks, and artillery in coordinated assaults. They would capture a workshop in the morning after hours of fighting, leaving dozens dead on both sides. At dusk, Soviet counterattacks would retake it through underground passages. The next morning, the Germans would attack again in an endless cycle. Entire days passed, with the front line moving 10 meters back and forth like a pendulum. In the Red October plant, German and Soviet soldiers fought on different floors of the same building, separated by concrete ceilings that shook continuously with grenades and submachine gun fire. One Soviet lieutenant, Anatoly Ivanov, later provided a haunting account. "We were fighting in what had been the foundry. There were vats of molten metal, already cooling but still hot enough to burn flesh from bone. Men fell in during the fighting, thrown by explosions, shot and falling backward, or pushed in close combat. The screams lasted only seconds, but we heard them in our sleep for years afterward. The smell of burning flesh mixed with cordite and concrete dust. That's what I remember about Red October. The smell that never left my nostrils." The fighting was so intense that units were ground down to fragments within days of arrival. The German 24th Panzer Division, which had begun the battle with over 14,000 men and hundreds of tanks, was reduced to fewer than 2,000 combatant effectives and 30 operational vehicles by late October. The division was effectively destroyed, but remained in the line because there were no replacements available from the rear. Similarly, Soviet divisions were fed into the factories, consumed in days of fighting, and replaced by fresh units ferried across the Volga at night in a constant rotation. Soviet reinforcements faced their own nightmare, the Volga crossing under fire. Every night, boats, barges, and improvised rafts carried men, ammunition, and supplies across the river under German artillery fire. The river was over a kilometer wide at Stalingrad, offering no cover whatsoever. German artillery batteries on the western bank, firing by sound and muzzle flash, scored frequent hits on the crowded vessels. Boats exploded or capsized, spilling their human cargo into the freezing water. Many soldiers drowned, weighted down with equipment, unable to swim in the darkness. Those who reached the western bank were immediately sent into combat, often dying before they learned their comrades' names or the layout of their positions. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was estimated at 24 hours from arrival. For newly arrived soldiers sent directly into the factory fighting, it was even less. One Soviet colonel stated matter-of-factly, "A division crosses the Volga with 10,000 men. 3 days later, it has 2,000 effectives. A week later, it must be withdrawn and rebuilt from scratch." Yet the Soviets held their positions. Barely, but they held, against overwhelming odds. And while von Mannstein focused obsessively on taking the factories, convinced that victory was just one more attack away, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was planning something that would transform the entire strategic situation. Operation Uranus. While German soldiers fought and died in Stalingrad's ruins, the broader strategic situation was shifting catastrophically against them without their knowledge. The obsessive focus on taking the city had blinded German command to a fundamental vulnerability. Their flanks were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, Germany's allies, poorly equipped, under strength, spread thin across hundreds of kilometers, and with questionable morale and fighting capacity. Marshal Zhukov, observing the German fixation on Stalingrad, recognized the golden opportunity. If massive Soviet forces struck the vulnerable flank simultaneously, they could encircle the entire Sixth Army in a massive pocket. The operation, codenamed Uranus, would require secrecy, coordination, and reserves on a massive scale. Throughout October and early November, Soviet forces assembled in hidden positions, over 1 million men, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft. The Germans suspected nothing substantial. Reconnaissance flights reported increased Soviet activity, but German intelligence dismissed it as defensive preparations or deception.
On 19th November 1942 at 7:30 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire along a front stretching over 250 kilometers. The barrage was apocalyptic in scale. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously, saturating Romanian positions with high explosive and fragmentation shells. Romanian units, already demoralized and inadequately supplied, disintegrated under the onslaught within hours. By afternoon, Soviet tank columns were pouring through the gaps, driving deep into the German rear areas. The next day, 20th November, Soviet forces struck from the south with equal force and violence. Again, Romanian defenses collapsed like a house of cards. Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s and some American-supplied M4 Shermans, raced westward, bypassing centers of resistance, driving toward a single objective, the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad, where the pincers would meet. On 22nd November, the two Soviet pincers met near Kalach. The trap was closed with devastating finality. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, including Romanian and Croatian units, was encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. In Stalingrad itself, German soldiers continued fighting for factories and streets, unaware that they were already trapped in a massive pocket with no escape route. Von Mannstein, stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune, requested permission to break out westward while there was still time and fuel. Hitler's response was immediate and unequivocal: no withdrawal. The Sixth Army would hold its positions at all costs. Stalingrad would not be abandoned under any circumstances. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made a catastrophic promise. He could supply the pocket by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily, the minimum needed to keep the army operational and combat effective. It was a complete fantasy divorced from reality. The Luftwaffe had never successfully supplied a pocket this size under these conditions. Winter weather, Soviet air defenses, the distances involved, and the number of available transport aircraft made the task impossible from the start. Yet Hitler believed it, or claimed to believe it, and von Mannstein obeyed orders as he always had. The Sixth Army would remain in the pocket, and Stalingrad would become not a Nazi triumph, but a Nazi tomb for hundreds of thousands. December 1942 brought winter to southern Russia with savage intensity. Temperatures plummeted to -30, -40 degrees Celsius in the worst nights. Snow fell continuously, covering the ruins in a white shroud that turned Stalingrad into a frozen hell. German soldiers, many still wearing the summer uniforms in which they had advanced across the steppes in August, began to freeze to death. Frostbite became epidemic throughout the pocket. Soldiers lost toes, fingers, ears, noses to the cold. Thousands suffered such severe frostbite that amputation was necessary, but medical supplies had run out. Surgeons performed operations without anesthesia, holding screaming patients down while they sawed through frozen limbs with whatever tools were available. Many died from shock or subsequent infections in the unsanitary conditions. But worse than the cold was the hunger gnawing at every soldier. The Luftwaffe's aerial supply effort was failing catastrophically. On good days, perhaps 100 tons of supplies reached the pocket, 1/5 of what was needed for basic survival. Many days, weather or Soviet fighters prevented any flights from landing. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, their frozen flesh hacked apart with axes and pickaxes. When the horses were gone, soldiers hunted rats in the ruins. Rations were reduced to starvation levels, 200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone combat effectiveness in the freezing cold. The combination of cold and starvation was lethal in its effects. Bodies too weak from hunger couldn't generate heat to survive. Soldiers froze to death in their positions, discovered at dawn stiff and blue, still clutching weapons they could no longer fire. Thousands died this way, not from Soviet bullets, but from exposure and starvation in the cruel winter. In Stalingrad's ruins, the nightmare continued without respite. Soviet forces, sensing victory, increased pressure systematically. They had been reinforced with fresh divisions, while the Germans grew weaker daily. The 62nd Army, which had clung desperately to a narrow strip along the Volga in September, now counterattacked aggressively, pushing German forces back from the river, reclaiming factories, workshops, and streets purchased with so much blood months earlier. German soldiers, now fighting for survival rather than victory, defended their positions with desperate courage born of hopelessness. But courage couldn't overcome empty stomachs and frozen bodies. Units dissolved as men died or simply gave up. Command structures broke down completely. Officers who attempted to enforce discipline were sometimes shot by their own men in acts of mutiny. Surrenders increased, though Hitler had forbidden it and made clear that families of soldiers who surrendered would face consequences from the SS. On 8 January 1943, the Red Army offered terms: surrender, and soldiers would be fed, warmed, and treated humanely according to the laws of war. Von Mannstein, still bound by Hitler's orders and his oath, refused. The Red Army attacked. Operation Ring, the final destruction of the pocket, began on 10th January with an artillery bombardment that consumed over 1 million shells in a few hours. Soviet infantry and tanks advanced systematically, crushing German positions, shrinking the pocket methodically, day by day.
By late January, the pocket had been split in 2 separate sections. All organized resistance was collapsing everywhere. German soldiers huddled in cellars, burning furniture for warmth when they had the strength, eating anything organic, wallpaper paste, leather belts, boot soles. Some lost their minds completely, wandering the ruins, talking to themselves, or to the frozen corpses that littered every street. On 30th January, Hitler promoted von Mannstein to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. It was an implicit order to commit suicide rather than face the humiliation of capture. Von Mannstein, broken and disillusioned, refused to comply. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Von Mannstein surrendered, along with his staff and the remains of his command. The southern pocket ceased to exist. The northern pocket held for 2 more days before collapsing on 2 February 1943. Of the 250,000 men encircled in November, only 90,000 survived to become prisoners of war. Of those, barely 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet prison camps from typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the after-effects of the frozen hell they had endured for months. Soviet casualties were equally horrific. The Red Army suffered over 1.1 million killed, wounded, and missing during the 5-month battle. Civilian deaths exceeded 40,000 in the initial bombing, with thousands more dying during the battle from starvation, disease, and violence. In total, perhaps 2 million people died in and around Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943. The city itself was unrecognizable. Aerial photographs showed a lunar landscape, craters, rubble, skeletal buildings, nothing else remaining. 99% of structures were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. It would take years to clear the rubble, decades to rebuild the city from scratch. But the strategic and psychological impact transcended statistics and numbers. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility forever. For the first time, an entire German army had been destroyed, not merely defeated, but annihilated completely. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart and intensified their activities. In Germany, morale collapsed among civilians. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. The German public, fed years of propaganda about inevitable victory, began to doubt the outcome of the war. For the Wehrmacht, the lessons of Stalingrad were devastating and irrefutable. The vaunted blitzkrieg doctrine, perfected in Poland and France, had proven useless in urban terrain. Combined arms coordination failed when the battlefield was reduced to room-by-room fighting. Air superiority meant nothing when friend and foe were separated by walls rather than open ground. German tactical flexibility and superior training were negated by an enemy willing to fight at intimate range, who turned every building into a fortress, who counterattacked relentlessly, who made every meter cost more than the Germans could afford to pay.
The Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in Wehrmacht doctrine. When forced to fight on unfavorable terrain under conditions that negated their advantages, German forces could be beaten decisively. The Red Army learned these lessons well and applied them systematically. From Stalingrad forward, they would use urban terrain to their advantage, forcing the Germans into close-quarters battles in cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and eventually Berlin itself, where the final battle would be fought. Vasily Petrov survived the battle and was promoted to higher command, eventually commanding Soviet forces that accepted Berlin's surrender in May 1945. His tactics, hugging the enemy, active defense, aggressive counterattacks, and exploiting urban terrain, would be studied in military academies worldwide for generations, influencing urban warfare doctrine for decades to come. Von Mannstein, broken by his experience and the loss of his army, would testify against Nazi war crimes at Nuremberg before dying in East Germany in 1957, haunted by memories of the frozen hell he had survived and the soldiers he had been unable to save. The ruins of Stalingrad stand as a testament to human courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of urban warfare. The battle changed not just the course of World War II, but the nature of warfare itself. It proved that technology and superior training could be overcome by determination, tactical adaptation, and the willingness to fight for every meter of ground. The city that bore Stalin's name became the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions and the turning point of the greatest conflict in human history.